Well, I want to first say that I don't speak in absolutes by saying that all people are this or all people are that. But I do want to make it sort of kind of historically clear why the Civil War took place. And it had nothing to do with freeing African people. That wasn't its purpose. And what's important, like, for instance, when you look at the 3/5 clause, okay, that didn't have anything to do with black people personally. That had to do with the white landowner and how many votes he could have, because at that time, your possessions or your property determined how many votes you had, okay? And because white males could only own land and property, then this was geared towards them. So the 3/5 clause of a man said that if you put 5 black folk together, if you own 5 Africans, you have 3 votes. That had nothing to do with considering African people. They considered African people chattel. You were not a human being. But for the vote, the 3/5 clause said if you own 5 Africans, as according to their law, if you own 5 Africans, you have 3 votes. The Civil War, like that, had nothing to do with freeing African people. What you're dealing with is an economic system that you're dealing with. In other words, you're dealing with people who are enslaving African people. And the reason why they outlawed the enslavement of they outlawed the enslavement of African people before they so-called freed African people. But the reason why they outlawed the actual capture of Africans was not because they didn't want to capture Africans anymore. It was because there was an overabundance of African people coming to this part of the world that they could not maintain and control because of all of the revolutions and the revolts that were happening throughout the American hemisphere, including Central, South America, and the Caribbean. And so what they began to do was that African people coming in, you see, one of the misnomers that we do is that we, in our social studies classes and in our history classes, we say that slaves were brought to America from Africa. And that's not true. Human beings were stolen from Africa, and they were enslaved in America. There's a different thing. A slave is a noun that describes a person. Enslaved is a process that you put a human being through. 2 different things altogether. Because in a children's mind, they'll say, well, if they were slaves in Africa, it would only make sense that they're slaves in America. But if they were human beings that were stolen from Africa and enslaved in America, then that's a whole nother way in which that child's going to look at that situation. So when African people came here, they came here as cobblers. They made shoes. They were doctors. They were lawyers. They were masons. They built buildings. They were spiritual leaders. They had many different talents that they brought with them, and they used those talents when they came here. And because they were forced to do things that was backbreaking, like picking cotton, and painful, and other things they had to do because Europeans didn't want to do it, and therefore they did not have the skill to do it, black folk got the skills, and they got better at it. And they began to build machines, like a cotton gin, that would make their job easier. However, if you had 4 Africans on your plantation that did a series of work that said, let's take 3 days, and if you could have a machine that could do those 4 Africans' job in 4 hours, then over 4 days you're going to have 4 times the amount of produce or raw material that you had prior to that happening. And so what began to happen is that there was, as it relates to supply and demand, there began to become a stifling with demand, but an overabundance of supply. And so what was given birth was a new level of industry that Africans had built. Africans were the first industrial revolution. They were the industrial revolution. Africans built machines that would lead to what we call the Industrial Revolution. And what began to happen is that if you could buy an African for $300 for life, and then you had to pay someone $300 a year to work for you, which would you do? Chances are you would probably buy the person one time to get 20 years of work as opposed to paying somebody $300 for 20 years. However, the enslavement of a human being is opposite to the precepts and the principles of capitalism, which is competition. Who can compete with someone who is enslaved? You can't compete. So therefore, the production abilities lessens because you have no competition. Not to mention that black folk were setting farms on fire and things like that. And so what they had to do is they had to free Africans. But what had happened was the weather and climate of the South was better for growing the materials than the North. So what the North did after a certain period of time, they became the industrial capital. They built the factories where the raw materials were sent from the South to produce clothing and whatever else they wanted to do. So the North didn't have what we call enslaved, although they were as racist and white supremacist as the South. They did not have the enslavement of African people. And, you know, the Dred Scott decision proves that. So it's not even like, can you see that? You know, I mean, the largest plantation in the colonies in the mid-1700s was in Brooklyn, New York. A lot of folk don't realize that either. There was enslavement throughout the colonies. However, with the advent of this, the North said to the South, look, we got capitalism going here, you got to free the Africans. South said, why am I going to free my Africans? That's how I make my money. They say, well, because we need you to free the Africans because otherwise you'll stifle capitalism and competition. Well, the South said, well, I'm not worried about that because I'm producing the raw materials. I got nothing to do with the competition of your factories. I don't care about that. I'm making money. The North said, but you got to stop enslaving your Africans. South said, I'm not going to stop enslaving my Africans. It's not going to happen. They outlawed the importation of Africans, but they did not negate the process of enslavement. It still existed. No new Africans, but a little here and there. But the basic trafficking of Africans had ended. But they still had the enslavement of Africans, which stifled, suffocated competition. So the South said, I can't free my Africans, how to make my money. North said, you got to free your Africans. South said, why? They said, because we're suffering. South said, well, that's a personal problem. That's not my problem. They said, but we need your... They said, look, I can sell my raw materials to Europe and other parts of the world. I don't need you. You need us, because we have the raw materials. You have factories. Without raw materials, your factories will become ghost towns. I can sell my raw materials any place in the world. So the North said, you can't do that. South said, you know something? I'm through talking to you. Not only am I going to do it, but I'm going to secede from the Union. I'm not even going to be part of your thing. It ain't the North and South no more. It's just us, period. I don't care what happens to you. North said, you can't do that. South said, watch. And that started the Civil War. It had nothing to do with freeing African people. Freeing African people were only part of what would make the economic system be vibrant in the United States. Here's the evidence of it. When Africans were emancipated, so-called, and they went for the job, who better to run the machines than the ones that invented the machine? But white folk weren't going to do that. So what did they do? In 1870, they started to import the poor, the sick, the destitute, and the huddled masses of Europe, and that started the immigration movement in 1870 in order to not let Africans. And then what happened by 1877? The end of the Reconstruction period. And then the birth of the Ku Klux Klan. And that's the story of the Civil War. Because Abraham Lincoln said himself, if you read the book by Lerone Bennett, Forced into Glory, Abraham Lincoln said, if I could keep the Africans enslaved and preserve the Union, I would do that. But there's no way to do that. You have to ask yourself, why is there no way to do that? It's not because you love Africans, because you just said you did. It's because of the economic system that was about to come onto the scene, which we call capitalism, which is the economic system of so-called democracy.